Hello, my name is Sarah Barnes, and today I will be presenting on my instructional designer interview. I conducted this interview the summer of 2021 as part of EAC 580 at NC State University. The class is Designing Instructional Systems in Training and Development, and I am currently pursuing my Master's of Science in Technical Communication. So here's the agenda for my presentation today. First, I'm going to start by defining what an instructional designer is. Then I will go into my process for the interview, including identifying an instructional designer to interview, introducing the instructional designer, then showing how I developed my questions. Finally, I will conclude by sharing some main challenges and takeaways the instructional designer shared with me. Let's start by defining instructional design. The goal of instructional design is to make learning more efficient, more effective, and less difficult. I personally picture an instructional designer as someone who takes information and presents it in a way that will help learners comprehend that information. This could be someone with the title instructional designer, or it could be a teacher, a trainer, or someone like me whose profession is in communication. For me, it was important to get the perspective of others outside of my profession, which I was able to get from class discussions with my peers, as well as through my instructional designer interview. I began looking for an instructional designer who has experience in graphic design, marketing, and communications, like me. This was important to me because I didn't enter the class with the intentions of going into teaching like a lot of my fellow peers. I am currently pursuing my master's in technical communication, and I wanted to improve my ability to communicate to various audiences, which I thought I would be able to do throughout this course. I searched for instructional designer first on LinkedIn, then through an NC State directory, and I found a lot of instructional designers who had experience in higher education or training, and I thought I wouldn't be able to connect with them through an interview. I finally found an instructional designer with a bit of an unconventional education background, but I think I was able to learn a lot from him. The instructional designer I selected to interview was Alexander Schneider. I found him through a mutual connection at IBM. Alexander Schneider is a senior instructional designer at IBM. Alexander started off by pursuing his Bachelor of Arts and Sciences, majoring in philosophy. He intended to go into law, hoping he would be able to stand out in law school as someone who took an unconventional path to get there. He started working at AT&T in sales after graduation. Then he moved to Time Warner Cable, which in 2015 was acquired by Charter. This was when an opportunity presented itself for him to get a promotion. The position was in instructional design, a field in which he had no formal education. However, since the job was internal and they wanted someone with his sales background and knowledge of the product suite, he was hired, and then he was able to pursue his master's in instructional systems technology from UNC Charlotte. Then, in November of 2020, he got a position as senior instructional designer at IBM, which is where he is today. My background in graphic design, marketing, and communications helped me shape the questions I asked during my interview. After reading the list of questions we were given, I thought to myself, if I could ask Alexander anything, what would I want to know? As someone who sees themselves ending up in the tech industry, I wanted to ask Alexander some IBM-specific questions, as well as questions I thought could help me in my future career as a communicator. The first question I asked was, what instructional design projects have you worked on in the past, and how have you managed the different obstacles within that project? What advice would you give an instructional designer based on that experience? I then talked about that I'm interested in how his background affects his current work, and it asked, how have your experiences working at various companies shaped your work style? For the third question, I asked Alexander, how do you think COVID-19 has affected your work at IBM? Have your instructional design projects changed at all? I then asked, do you have any experience working with subject matter experts? If so, what are some challenges you have run into working with subject matter experts, and how do you think those challenges could be resolved? What have you learned from those experiences? Finally, I asked a more personal question. What advice would you give someone interested in both technology and instructional design? How could your instructional design skills translate to other fields, such as graphic design or another form of communication? Now, let's transition into some of the challenges and issues Alexander brought up during his interview. The biggest challenge he has run into in instructional design is communication. This challenge is twofold. First off, he mentioned that at IBM they use Slack as their main communication channel. At his prior roles, he was used to being more heads down and just getting his work done. At IBM, there's constant communication. His team utilizes Agile as opposed to the ADDIE model, which is typical in instructional design. When he entered the field of instructional design back when he was working at Charter, he learned using the ADDIE model, and he had to shift his skill set to fit into the Agile model. Secondly, Alexander mentioned that he had difficulty communicating with various stakeholders in the past. This can happen both internally and externally with clients, customers, focus groups, and even team members. Especially now that he is working remotely due to the pandemic, and that IBM is an international company, he has to communicate complex information while dealing with a language barrier and time differences. The next challenge Alexander addressed was education. This is not necessarily formal education, but just keeping yourself educated on everything instructional design. Like all industries, instructional design utilizes softwares and technologies that instructional designers need to know how to use. Sometimes that means teaching yourself in order to stay relevant and marketable. Alexander also mentioned that it is sometimes hard creating instructional design material around something that you've never learned. He feels like he's teaching something that was never actually taught to him. Yes, he works with subject matter experts, but it is still hard to know exactly what medium the audience will perceive the information best through without having learned it himself. Along those same lines, he lastly noted that there are different trends that he has to keep up with. Someone who has been in instructional design for decades would see the trend shifting towards more online and virtual instructional design. As a newbie to instructional design, Alexander hasn't experienced this too much until the pandemic. He was shown firsthand how virtual learning can be for various audiences, ranging from adult learners all the way down to first graders. Everyone learns differently online, and something that might work well for adult learners might not translate well for kids. That's something that the industry and really the world is adjusting to, how to incorporate different mediums for different types of learners. Finally, let's talk about some key takeaways from my interview. Alexander really focused on talking about incorporating your passion into your work. There are several ways you could do this, but if you find yourself in an industry that you're not super passionate about, you should try to incorporate things that you love into your current work. The example he gave was that Alexander claims to be a gamer, and he talked about how he wanted to see if he could incorporate virtual reality gaming into his instructional design. The next takeaway I took from our interview was to practice your communication skills as early and often as possible. You never know who you're going to be communicating with in the future, so early on in your career, practice communicating effectively and efficiently whenever you can. And finally, always be learning. As an instructional designer, Alexander really emphasized that it's important to stay up with current trends and continue to learn anywhere you can, whether that's from talking to a mentor or just getting as much experience as possible. And that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for taking your time to listen and watch my presentation on my interview with Alexander. Also, big shout out to Alexander. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day for me to ask you some questions, and thank you for all of the knowledge you shared with me. I really appreciated it, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Bye.